I went to India when I was 19 with a college friend. It was the late 60s, and we had dropped out of college, and her father was the consul general in Calcutta. And so the idea was that we would go to India and get involved in some kind of good works for the benefit of humanity and come to our senses and stop this kind of wild mystical search we were on. And so I was first in Calcutta, and we worked at Mother Teresa's orphanage and home for unwed mothers there. And then we went to Nepal, and there was something for me that happened when I even just saw Tibetan people. You know, at that time you didn't see Tibetans. I had never seen a Tibetan in my life, and had read a few books about Tibet, but had never met any. And so when I saw them, there was this feeling of fascination and recognition and longing. It was a very strong feeling of longing that I couldn't really name. And so we went to Kathmandu, and that's when I began to wake up with the horns in the morning, with the horns from the monastery. And I would go and sit in this corner of Swambhu temple, the Karyu monastery there, although I had no idea what it was at that time. I just would go every day and sit and meditate and sort of ride on the sound of the pujas and do my version of meditation. And gradually, after a while, they set up a little carpet for me there and started offering me tea. I was kind of in the corner, and it was an amazing feeling that somehow they were accepting me there. And there was one particular monk who we actually met when we went back on pilgrimage. His name was Gyalwa, and he was the one that would bring me the tea. And then I left Nepal and hitchhiked across India with a Japanese traveler friend that I had, and he was going to see the Dalai Lama. And then when we got to Dharamsala, this was in probably November of 1967, when we got there, he was invited to go into the monastery, and I was told I couldn't because I was a woman and I had to stay in town. And so I stayed in town and lived in this kind of shed made out of flattened kerosene cans, and didn't have a blanket or a sleeping bag, so I bought a blanket and a piece of cotton and sewed them together, and then rolled up newspaper and put that inside. And it was really cold, it was snowing, and so I didn't know anything in the sense of having read any books about Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism specifically, but I had this feeling about Tibetan people and a tremendous attraction to them, and would get up at 4 and do the circumambulation with them. And I remember in this little house, there was sort of left by somebody up on the mantle where the shrine must have been, a little medallion of the Dalai Lama, a little photograph, round photograph covered with glass or plastic or something, and some old protection cords. And to me, it was like this incredibly precious jewel that I had found. But I didn't take it because I didn't feel like it was mine, but it was just this feeling of, that was the sort of depth of my longing for something. And I was 19, so I really didn't know what it was. And then eventually I returned to the West and went back to school for a while, and then made my way to Europe, and then eventually to the first monastery in the Tibetan tradition in the West at Sammy Ling in Eskdalmuir, Scotland. And I met Trungpa Rinpoche there. He had just come out of the hospital the day that I arrived. He had been in a car accident. He had it was a very serious accident. And I had some amazing encounters with him, and then my longing brought me back to Nepal. And when I got back, I was walking around Kathmandu and reconnecting with old friends and so on, including this monk, Gyalwa. And he said, the Karmapa is here. And it was a huge event. He hadn't been there for years. I think it was 13 years. He hadn't been in Kathmandu. And it was a major event. Kathmandu was much smaller than it is today. And so everyone was sort of oriented around this visit of this great being. And eventually I met him and had this kind of wild, crazy idea of becoming a nun. And it really came out of this sadhana that I had gotten from Trungpa Rinpoche, called the sadhana of all the siddhas. And it was something he wrote in Paro Taksang in Bhutan. And it was about the Karmapa and also about Guru Rinpoche. And in it, there's a line that says, the only offering I can make is to follow your example. The only offering I can make is to follow your example. And somehow this particular line came back to me. And I thought, well, the Karmapa's a monk, so I should be a nun. And I didn't, again, have any idea what that meant, what the vows were. I wasn't even a Buddhist, you know, I hadn't taken refuge or anything. And I just started to develop this feeling that there was something I was supposed to do. It was a sort of, I wouldn't say exactly manic, but it was something like that, you know, where I couldn't sleep. I had this feeling of something I'm supposed to do, and I eventually decided it was that I was supposed to ask to become a nun. And so I remember I walked up the stairs of that monastery, that Kargyu monastery in Kathmandu on Swayambhu, the same place where I had sat before. The Karmapa now is in that monastery, and that's where he was based this whole visit. So it was, I had already developed a relationship with that place. And now it's 1969, and so he was sitting in there. I walked in, no prostrations or anything. I didn't know any of that, and just walked up to him, and I had flowers, and I offered him these flowers, and then motioned that I wanted to cut off my hair. And he looked at me with this amazing look. The Karmapa has amazing eyes, and it was like he was looking at all of my lives. He wasn't just seeing this. By then I think I was 22-year-old American girl. He was really looking at who I actually was. And he said, yes, meet me in Bodh Gaya in a week. I don't know why exactly he didn't do it there in Nepal, but he said, meet me in Bodh Gaya in a week. I had these huge wool Tibetan robes and headed for India. And eventually I was ordained in Bodh Gaya on the night of the full moon of January of 1970. And my witnesses were the four main tulkus of the Kargyu lineage: Jamon Kongtrul, Tai Situ, Gyaltsap, and Shamar.